Charlie, all right. It's good to have you back with me on this Friday. It's been a busy week.
Mhm.
Obviously, a lot of geopolitical events going on. The whole world seems in the second half of the week to be talking about China, Taiwan, but we're actually going to take the time to go back to something that seems like it was now ages ago, the death of Ayman al-Zawahiri. So first, talk to me, Charlie. Who was Zawahiri? Why did he matter? Give us a little context here.
Sure. Ayman al-Zawahiri was the one of the ideological founders of Al Qaeda. He was one of the original founding members of the group back in the early 90s. He founded the group with Osama bin Laden. They kind of formed an alliance together. Zawahiri brought the ideological metal to the group, kind of the more ideological structure to the group. He also brought a large number of Egyptian jihadists along with him, so he also brought numbers to the group. And he was Osama bin Laden's successor and has led Al Qaeda since 2011 when bin Laden was killed in a Navy SEAL raid.
Yeah, I mean, I know you mentioned specific the ideology there, and I think that's a really key point that obviously bin Laden had a big name on his own, but he seemed kind of at the end even of the Afghan war with the Mujahideen to kind of lack that real ideological metal that Zawahiri brought.
Yep.
And one thing that's really stuck out to me that has definitely gotten some media coverage, but I think deserves a little more attention is like this idea that Zawahiri brought about the far enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, this has kind of been the guiding light of global jihadism
Mhm.
since kind of the real founding of Al Qaeda in the late 90s, early 2000s, as kind of the group we know it today. But up until then, a lot of jihadist ideology was really about trying to attack the local governments in the Arab world that they saw as corrupt and decadent and pro Western. And it was really Zawahiri that brought this idea of no, actually, if we're kind of looking at this house of cards, we want to go to the foundation here and try to pull out kind of all the support. And in his mind, that was the United States, other Western governments to be sure, but really the US. And that really kind of transformed the dynamic. Obviously, September 11th was the really tragic apex of that. But, we saw this even in other major Al Qaeda attacks, the embassy bombings in 98, the Cole bombing 2 years later, going after those real symbols of American power. And that was something that really stuck out to me. And we'll come back to that at the end of our conversation. But I guess my next question for you then is, all right, Zawahiri is dead. Kind of who's next? What does Al Qaeda move on to? Who do they have in the pipeline?
Well, so according to UN reporting on the UN monitoring group released a report fortuitously shortly before the U.S. strike, giving us a rough idea of Al Qaeda's line of succession. And the first man on the list theoretically is a man named Saif al-Adil. The problem with Saif al-Adil and possibly the second man on the list in the line of succession, I believe is Abdul Rahman al-Maghribi. They're both in it believed to be in Iran, which is a problem for Al Qaeda given its image as a Sunni jihadist group. And so there is a possibility that the line of succession may be somewhat impacted by Zawahiri's death, and so they may choose somebody further down the list. But at this point, Saif al-Adil appears to be the most likely candidate of the list of candidates, and he is also an Egyptian. He was a member of Egyptian military, either special forces or airborne. It's somewhat nebulous, but he was also a jihadist veteran of the Afghan jihad, and also he was a fellow Egyptian, and he has more military and operational experience to his background. So whereas Zawahiri was more of an ideologue, uh, Saif al-Adil was more of brings a military skill level with him. He trained Somali jihadists, or believed to have trained Somali jihadists. He's done some other training missions with other jihadist groups, so that's kind of his background. And he is probably the most likely, although, as I mentioned, he is currently in prison in Iran. Well, not in prison, but in house arrest in Iran.
Yeah, as close
Um,
to whatever that means for the Iranian
so,
authorities as you can get.
so his presence in Iran may be a hindrance to his selection, because the Sunni jihadists try and keep their relations with Iran on the quiet for sectarian reasons. So it is possible Saif al-Adil gets passed over, but let's assume he is that guy. Then we're probably going to be looking at a continuation of Al Qaeda. He will probably try and keep the organization cohesive and coherent, and he probably won't represent a major change from Zawahiri, although he will probably he has less of the ideological chops, so he'll probably focus more on the organizational and operational details of the organization, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you highlighted a bunch of trade-offs there. I mean, obviously, the Iran connection is a huge challenge, but I think more fundamentally than these points is like kind of the old guard, the obvious choices here are no longer there. ISIS has obviously suffered a lot of defeats in the past few years, but really eclipsed Al Qaeda, certainly in the minds of Western counterterrorism professionals in the past decade. And you've seen a whole host of local groups sprout up in the past decade. I mean, so Al Qaeda, just even as an entity, is not what it was on September 11th or in the decade thereafter. And so, you have a huge challenge here, no matter who they pick. I mean, starting with the idea of just you're going to have to get your message out there to try to get your arms around this massive organization. And I mean, that's hugely risky for a few reasons. One, I mean, you have to put yourself out there, which of course raises your operational profile. And I'm sure all the counterterrorism professionals in the West are just figuring out who's going to pop up, how can we take him out as quickly as possible, just like they've done with a number of ISIS leaders since the end of Baghdadi. And then on the other hand, you have to convince this massive sprawling organization of kind of disparate groups that you're the man to unite them. And that's no easy task because, I mean, one of the real challenges for Zawahiri's tenure was that under his kind of direction, the group really suffered a huge number of setbacks. They weren't able to capitalize on the Syrian civil war in the way they would have liked. They obviously suffered hugely at the expense of ISIS, which really took up the mantle of the global jihad. And now, arguably, kind of their most successful franchises in parts of Africa in particular are in some ways kind of the most disconnected, it seems, from the group's traditional stronghold that's ostensibly in South Asia and parts of the Middle East. So I don't know what you do if you're the next person here. You've got a real challenge on your hands.
Indeed, you do, and it's one of those. It's a very difficult position for Al Qaeda to be in at this point. They obviously, Zawahiri was able to maintain the internal cohesiveness of the organization to an extent, but he also oversaw the organization during the split with Islamic State, which continues to dog Al Qaeda and continues to be a major problem for Al Qaeda. He also oversaw the defection of the Syrian affiliate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, which basically lost them a major Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So the organization is going to have a very difficult time. On the positive side of the ledger, Jama'a Nusra al-Islam wal Muslimin, the Sahelian slash Lake Chad Basin jihadist group, did come into formation during Zawahiri's tenure. And additionally, the militant group Al-Shabaab has also remained highly effective in Somalia. But again, as you mentioned, these groups are somewhat disconnected from Al-Qaeda core. So bringing them back into the fold and managing a global jihadist network is going to be a serious challenge for whoever the new leader is. And Saif al-Adil, just to mention Saif al-Adil again, as a person, I'm not sure he's necessarily up to that task. He's certainly got the managerial skills and the military skills, but there's that vision and that ideological component that is going to be also very important for Al-Qaeda's new leader. So they may need to also add somebody else with ideological chops to kind of balance them out, whether it's a new deputy or some other leader that is younger or has a more forward-looking vision that can really kind of give the group new life with its supporters.
Yeah, I mean, you're really outlining a mixed record for Zawahiri, huge challenges for the next guy. And I'm glad you ended kind of with the context in Africa here, because a few things that stick out to me. One, talking, as I had started out at the beginning, mentioning this idea of the far enemy that Zawahiri brought to the organization. When you look at the most kind of successful franchise that Al-Qaeda has right now, it's really JNIM, as you highlighted, and Al-Shabaab. Now, we've definitely detected some kind of external operations plotting from Shabaab, but even so, the main focus of the group has undoubtedly been Somalia. And JNIM, while they may one day aspire to try to attack the West, from everything we've seen, they've just been 100% focused on expanding locally in Africa. And so, if you're thinking from kind of the strategic standpoint of threat to the West, there's a whole lot locally to be concerned about. But I don't see either of these franchises investing, with the slight exception of we've seen a little bit from Somalia, certainly with Al Shabaab, the resources to attack the West. And even if they may have that motivation, the capability has clearly not been there to the same degree that Zawahiri probably would have liked in a far enemy strategy. And all right, kind of perhaps ironically, and the group within Al Qaeda that has historically had the closest connection to AQ Core and that has been the most focused on attacking the West, their affiliate in Yemen, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Sure, you hear from time to time, but compared to their activities a decade ago, I mean, they've really also been decimated by a huge amount of counterterrorism pressure. The Yemen civil war, they've been completely unable to take advantage of. And so you really are in a situation where some of the most attractive Al Qaeda affiliates are not necessarily following the historic Al Qaeda guidance, and the areas that have really just been decimated. So it's a pretty big contradiction for the group.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what their vision is going to be going forward, if they're going to continue that focus on the far enemy or if they are going to focus more on the local conflicts, just given as it not necessarily as an ideological or for a lack of willpower, but it is more of a resource problem, as well as the focuses of the various affiliates. You've got, again, you mentioned JNIM and Shabab, both are focused on those nearer threats, or well, the nearer enemies to them, which are the Somali government in Shabab's case, and then the various governments in West Africa and the Sahel in JNIM's case. So not that there wouldn't be the desire to hit Western targets, and certainly we may see Western targets in region being threatened. So embassies, French military presence in West Africa, other kinds of targets, but we're not necessarily likely to see a major um, uh, attempt, or at least a full, throated attempt. There could be a disrupted plot for sure, but a major serious attempt at an attack in the West, at least not in the near term. Down the road, if Al Qaeda can manage this period effectively, and if things particularly continue to keep going bad for Islamic State, they might be able to, down the road, consider increasing their focus on the West again at some point, either through recruiting Westerners again, perhaps using their JNIM affiliate to recruit West African, to recruit African diaspora, or other, or perhaps recruiting from the Somali diaspora communities. But in the near term, it's not looking good for a major threat to the West at this point.
Yeah, and those points bring up two things that I guess I'll end our conversation with. It strikes me you were highlighting how there could certainly be these one-offs, et cetera. Ultimately, there's a big distinction between kind of the continual plotting that Al Qaeda did in the late 90s, early 2000s, directly against Western targets, involving a huge amount of complex attacks featuring different types of weapons, multiple operatives deployed from abroad, really the proverbial whole 9 yards. And even if one of these groups was trying to aspire to do one of these things today, cognizant of all the risks that it would involve, I just don't see their capability to go beyond one or two, as horrific as they may be on their own. That's still a far shadow of what we really in a threat environment saw around the turn of the millennium, where it was almost every week there was a new plot that was being uncovered. And crucially, so many of the attacks that we've seen in recent years have been more of this kind of inspired variety, where it's an individual or a small cell. Maybe they were in contact with someone, oftentimes not. They were just inspired by propaganda, kind of acting on their own. And if you think about the planning and preparation that went into not even a plot like 9/11, but even some of the less complex ones, I mean, that's a real shadow of its former self from the group. So there's definitely a big proverbial hole to dig out of. But it strikes me that we spent a lot of our time talking about Africa, which, if you ask the CT world a decade, 2 decades ago, everything was about the Middle East and South Asia. And of course, it's obviously notable and symbolic that Zawahiri was found in Afghanistan, in Kabul. That's a whole other, topic of conversation that we don't have the time for today, about what that means for the Taliban. But we spend so much time talking about Africa, and one of the ideas, and I'll key in our listeners to something that we've been kicking around as a team is like, has the center of gravity in the global jihad started to shift towards Africa, or is it even already there? I mean, so many of the concerns that we see nowadays are more about these affiliates expanding across Africa, cognizant that, of course, this is a global threat. The Middle East and South Asia still, of course, matter a lot, but the most success that a lot of these groups are finding is tragically among these really fragile, under resourced, and low capability states in parts of Africa.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, we've seen it in Burkina Faso and West Africa, and littoral West Africa increasingly. We also see it in, as we mentioned earlier, in Sahel. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that the center of gravity has shifted, but certainly the ability to host these larger groups in the Middle East and South Asia is increasingly constrained by that counterterrorism pressure that we talked about. And so these under-resourced states in Central and West Africa provide more of the, have more ability to provide a potential, if not a willing safe haven, certainly have more potential to pan out for the group as far as being able to host those larger groups and be able to launch more sizable operations, especially given the focus of CT organizations in MENA.
Yeah, I mean, plenty to think about there. We could obviously talk all afternoon, Charlie. I know as soon as we get offline, we're probably going to talk on chat about some other things we're working on, but let's call it for there for now for our listeners. Obviously, you can read all of our analysis, listen to podcasts, a whole host of other things that we do at ranenetwork.com. Please come and check out all the things that we're doing, because me, Charlie, our whole team of analysts, these are the questions we're looking in and day out. And I want to compliment Charlie and the rest of our analytic team, because I just think you guys are doing incredible work covering not only this issue, which of course goes in a ton of different directions, but obviously all the other things that are going on in the world. I know that my counterparts fought for this slot on Friday because, of course, there's also China-Taiwan. So please, there's no shortage of things for us to be discussing, and we hope that you'll read and visit all of our content, ranenetwork.com. Have a great rest of your Friday and a nice weekend.